Have you ever heard of a man who healed himself? Not with medicine, not with herbs, not with surgery, but with his mind. Centuries ago, in a small, secluded monastery nestled deep within the misty mountains of Japan, there lived a wise Zen master named Hakuin. Revered for his wisdom, Hakuin was one of the greatest teachers of his time. But what few knew was that in his middle years, the master fell gravely ill. His body weakened, his energy drained, and even the finest healers of the land declared there was no cure for his condition. Most would have given up. But Hakuin did something extraordinary. He turned inward. He sat in silence, day after day, focusing his attention not on the sickness, but on the very nature of his mind. He began to meditate, cultivating deep stillness and clarity, visualizing healing light filling his body, and letting go of every anxious, fearful thought. Weeks passed. Then months, and one day, as quietly as the illness had come, it began to fade. The master recovered, not just in body, but in spirit. His story became legend, passed down from monk to monk, generation after generation, as a timeless reminder of the mind's mysterious, hidden power. Now, before you dismiss this as just another ancient folk tale, consider this: modern science is beginning to catch up. Over the last few decades, researchers around the world have discovered something astonishing: your thoughts, emotions, and mental habits are intimately connected to your physical health. Chronic stress, anxiety, anger, and fear don't just weigh down your heart and mind. They silently poison your body. Conversely, peace of mind, clarity, and inner calm can trigger healing responses that medicine alone cannot explain. And so today, we ask a question as old as time. Can the mind heal the body? In a world where modern medicine often treats symptoms but neglects the soul, millions are turning to ancient practices like meditation, mindfulness, and breathwork in search of something deeper. Something medicine alone cannot offer. But what does healing truly mean? Is it the disappearance of disease? The vanishing of pain? Or is it something subtler, a profound inner transformation where, regardless of the body's condition, the mind rests in peace? Buddhism has a fascinating perspective on this. For over 2,500 years, Buddhist masters have taught that the body and mind are not two separate things, but reflections of one another. A troubled mind manifests in a troubled body. A restless spirit invites disease. And when the mind is clear, steady, and free from clinging, even the frailest body can find peace. Modern science, too, is beginning to reveal how meditation changes the brain, reduces stress hormones, improves immune function, and even affects our DNA. But how exactly does this happen? Is there truly a connection between our thoughts and our cells? Between our breath and our blood pressure? Between silence and survival? In this series, we're going to journey deep into that mystery. We'll explore the ancient wisdom of Buddhist philosophy, uncover cutting-edge scientific research, and hear the real stories of people who have transformed their lives, and sometimes even their illnesses, through meditation. You'll discover how chronic stress subtly erodes your body from within. You'll learn how unresolved emotions silently give birth to disease. And you'll see how meditation isn't just a practice for monks in robes, but a powerful tool for anyone, anywhere, facing physical or emotional suffering, because you see, healing isn't always about fighting against disease. Sometimes, it's about letting go. About understanding the hidden patterns within us that lead to imbalance and opening a space for something new to emerge. And so we begin our journey here, with a simple but powerful idea: what if the greatest medicine isn't something you swallow, but something you awaken within? Most people believe that illness strikes from the outside, a virus invades. An accident happens. Bad genes get passed down. Bad luck. But what if, far more often than we realize, illness takes root within, not in the lungs, not in the heart, not even in the blood, but in the mind? For thousands of years, Buddhist masters observed a truth that modern medicine is only beginning to catch up to: the body and mind are not two, but one seamless reality. What stirs in the mind inevitably ripples through the body. Every thought, every emotion leaves its mark, like a stone dropped into a still pond. It begins with what the Buddha called kilesa, mental impurities like greed, anger, fear, attachment, and delusion. These invisible forces cloud perception, disturb the heart, and create restless tension within, and that tension doesn't stay in the mind alone, it triggers a biological chain reaction. When anxiety flares, stress hormones flood the bloodstream, the heart pounds faster, the muscles tense, the breath shortens, the immune system falters, the body shifts into survival mode, prepared to fight or flee. This ancient mechanism was designed for brief moments of danger, but today's world doesn't let us switch it off. Deadlines, traffic, social pressure, sleepless nights, unfinished conversations looping endlessly in the head. These modern predators don't come with claws and teeth, but with glowing screens and unspoken expectations. And so the body lives in a state of quiet emergency, day after day. Year after year, the damage is subtle at first, a knot in the stomach, a stiff neck, a headache that won't quite leave, but over time, these small imbalances accumulate, blood pressure rises, inflammation spreads, the immune system weakens, cells age faster. Harvard Medical School found that chronic anger and anxiety increase the risk of heart disease far more than diet or genetics alone. Another study revealed that unresolved grief leaves measurable traces in the bloodstream, raising inflammation markers linked to arthritis, autoimmune diseases, even certain cancers. The truth is, most of us are carrying an invisible chain around our necks. A weight made of restless thoughts, old grudges, unspoken fears, and relentless cravings. It tightens with every resentment we refuse to release, every fear we avoid confronting, every desire we chase believing it will make us whole, and because it's invisible, we tell ourselves, "I'm fine." Until one day, we're not. This is what the Buddha called dukkha, the subtle, persistent dissatisfaction that arises when we cling to pleasure, resist pain, and deny the impermanence of all things. Left unchecked, it poisons the body. But here's where ancient wisdom offers a way through. The body, bound by the mind, can also be freed by the mind, and this is the essence of meditation. Not just a practice of closing the eyes and chasing calm, but a courageous turning inward, a willingness to witness the restless waves of thought, to see clearly the patterns of fear, anger, craving, and sorrow that quietly shape our biology. With each breath of awareness, the invisible chain begins to loosen. Neuroscientists have discovered that meditation reduces cortisol, lowers blood pressure, improves heart rate variability, and even slows cellular aging. Hospitals, cancer clinics, and trauma centers across the world are integrating mindfulness into their treatments, because patients who meditate heal faster, experience less pain, and recover with greater resilience. Yet long before these clinical trials, Buddhist monks understood it through direct experience. They saw that when the mind is agitated, the body suffers. When the mind softens, the body responds. And when the mind is free, even physical limitations lose their power to define us. This isn't mystical thinking, it's the natural law of cause and effect, played out not just in the world around us, but within the intimate theater of our own being. To break free, we must first recognize how deeply our mental habits shape our physical reality. Every worry, every resentment, every burst of jealousy leaves a chemical signature, a ripple in the nervous system, a subtle tightening in the muscles, a cascade of invisible changes in the bloodstream. And so the healing must begin not only with treatments for the body, but with a clear, compassionate attention to the mind. This is why wisdom traditions for centuries have valued meditation not as a religious ritual, but as a medicine of the heart, a way to dissolve the mental poisons before they crystallize into physical disease. It invites a profound shift, from fighting symptoms to addressing their invisible source, from numbing discomfort to listening to its message, from chasing cures to cultivating inner balance. And as clarity returns, the body, long burdened by the storms of thought, begins to restore itself in ways both subtle and miraculous. The mechanism of this healing is no longer a mystery. Modern science has begun to trace its pathways in the brain, the immune system, and even at the level of our DNA, and it is here, in this delicate, wondrous meeting point between ancient wisdom and modern discovery, that the real secret of mind-body medicine lives. Imagine for a moment a glass of water. If you stir it constantly, the water becomes cloudy, restless, impossible to see through, but when you set it down and leave it undisturbed, slowly, the sediment settles. The water clears. This is precisely what happens within us. Every day, countless thoughts swirl through the mind, worries about tomorrow, regrets from yesterday, plans, fears, desires, an endless stream. Each one leaves a trace, a ripple through the nervous system, and over time, this ceaseless agitation clouds the inner environment, disrupting the delicate balance our body depends upon to heal. But when the mind grows still, something remarkable begins. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what ancient meditation masters long understood through direct experience. The mind possesses an extraordinary influence over the body's chemistry. When you enter a meditative state, even for a few minutes, measurable changes begin to occur. The heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline recede, and the body shifts from a state of fight or flight into rest and repair. This shift isn't subtle, it's a biological cascade. A chain reaction that touches every organ, every cell. Brain imaging studies reveal that during meditation, the amygdala, the brain's fear center, quiets down. At the same time, regions responsible for focus, empathy, and emotional regulation grow more active. It's as if the mind, when brought into stillness, becomes a gentle healer, moving through the body's systems, repairing what has quietly unraveled in the chaos of daily life. But beyond these immediate effects lies something deeper. Meditation initiates a kind of cellular housekeeping. Scientists have discovered that regular meditation increases levels of an enzyme called telomerase, which protects the caps at the ends of your DNA strands, known as telomeres. These caps naturally shorten with age and stress, leading to cell decay and disease. But in those who meditate, telomeres erode more slowly, preserving youthfulness and cellular integrity. It's as if each moment of awareness extends a silent hand to the very core of our biology, slowing the march of time. And yet, even more astonishing is what meditation reveals about pain and suffering. In clinical trials, patients with chronic pain were taught to meditate. They didn't try to block the pain or replace it with positive thoughts. They simply observed it, witnessed the sensations without resistance, without labels, and what happened was extraordinary. The intensity of their pain decreased, not because the cause vanished, but because their relationship to it transformed. This principle is ancient. The Buddha described it through the metaphor of the two arrows. The first arrow is the unavoidable pain life brings, sickness, aging, loss. The second arrow is the suffering we create by resisting that pain, through fear, through anger, through the desperate craving for it to be different. Meditation removes the second arrow. By cultivating awareness, we soften the mind's reflex to fight reality, and in doing so, the body relaxes its grip, letting healing energies flow freely once more. It isn't a magic spell, it doesn't promise immortality, but it awakens a natural, often forgotten capacity within us, the ability to meet discomfort without collapsing beneath it, to watch thoughts without being ruled by them, to allow grief, anger, or fear to arise and pass, like clouds across an open sky. And when this happens, the body listens, hormones rebalance, the immune system strengthens, inflammation decreases, sleep deepens, even the heart's rhythm shifts into a coherent, harmonious pattern, something researchers call heart rate variability. A powerful marker of resilience and longevity. It's no wonder that hospitals now use mindfulness-based programs for patients battling cancer, heart disease, addiction, and trauma, because beneath the symptoms, beneath the clinical diagnoses, lies a simple truth: a body in conflict with the mind cannot heal, but a body at peace, guided by a mind aware and still, remembers how. This was never a secret reserved for monks in mountain monasteries. It belongs to every one of us. A simple breath, a single moment of attention, a pause between one thought and the next. Within that space, the ancient healing mechanism stirs, the knots begin to loosen, and the body, relieved of the relentless pressure of restless thought, quietly moves toward balance. The most remarkable part: this healing isn't something we have to earn. It isn't reserved for the virtuous or the wise. It's as near as your next breath, as present as the awareness you're experiencing right now. listening to these words. And as this understanding deepens, it changes not only how we heal, but how we live, because to care for the mind is to care for the body, and to tend to the heart is to nurture every cell it animates. For centuries, meditation was seen primarily as a spiritual practice, a path to enlightenment, inner peace, and liberation from suffering, but in recent decades, science has begun to unlock its remarkable potential as a healing tool for the body. Medical laboratories and research centers around the world have turned their lenses toward this ancient practice, asking a simple yet profound question: can meditation truly heal illness? The answer, backed by thousands of studies, is an emphatic yes, though the story is far richer and more complex than a simple cure. One of the most groundbreaking findings comes from the field of neuroscience. Researchers using MRI scans have observed significant structural changes in the brains of long-term meditators. Areas responsible for attention, emotional regulation, and self-awareness, such as the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, show increased thickness and activity. At the same time, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system that triggers fear and stress, tends to shrink. This rewiring of the brain helps meditators manage stress more effectively, reducing the harmful physical effects that chronic stress wreaks on the body. Chronic stress is often called the silent killer. Linked to heart disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, and even cancer, by reducing stress through meditation, the body experiences profound changes in key biological markers. For instance, cortisol, the primary stress hormone, consistently decreases in people who meditate regularly. Lower cortisol means less inflammation, a central factor in many chronic diseases. Studies also reveal that meditation boosts immune function. One landmark study found that people who practiced mindfulness meditation had higher levels of antibodies after receiving a flu vaccine, suggesting a stronger immune response. Another fascinating area of research involves epigenetics, the study of how our environment and behaviors influence the way our genes express themselves. Meditation appears to positively affect gene expression, turning on protective genes that fight inflammation and oxidative stress while turning off genes linked to disease. Beyond these cellular effects, meditation has shown remarkable benefits in clinical settings. Patients suffering from chronic pain, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and addiction have all reported significant improvements after adopting mindfulness and meditation practices. In many cases, meditation acts as a powerful complement to conventional treatments, enhancing overall recovery and reducing reliance on medications. The National Institutes of Health now recognize mindfulness meditation as an evidence-based therapy for various conditions, but science is not just interested in how meditation helps patients, it is fascinated by the precise mechanisms behind its power. How can sitting quietly and observing the breath alter the immune system or gene activity? The answer lies in the intricate communication between the brain, nervous system, and body, a dynamic conversation called the mind-body connection. Meditation modulates this connection by activating the parasympathetic nervous system, often called the rest and digest system, which counterbalances the stress-driven sympathetic nervous system. This activation slows heart rate, lowers blood pressure, improves digestion, and fosters cellular repair. In other words, meditation tunes the body's natural healing processes. Scientists also explore how meditation influences neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt throughout life. Rather than being fixed, the brain rewires itself with each experience and habit. Meditation creates new neural pathways that support calm, focus, and emotional resilience, helping break the cycles of negative thinking that fuel illness. One of the most powerful examples of meditation's impact is in reducing inflammation, a root cause of many diseases, by quieting stress and calming the nervous system. Meditation lowers levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, chemicals that trigger and sustain inflammation. Less inflammation means lower risk of heart attacks, strokes, arthritis, and even some cancers. The scientific story is compelling, yet, beyond the data and statistics, meditation's healing power reveals a deeper truth. The mind is not just a passenger in the journey of illness and health. It is an active participant, a conscious agent capable of steering the body toward balance or chaos, and meditation offers a way to take the wheel, to shift from unconscious reactivity to mindful presence, from fragmented suffering to wholeness, in this dance between ancient wisdom and modern science. The promise of healing through meditation shines bright, not as a miracle cure, but as a profound practice accessible to anyone willing to explore the depths of their own mind. It invites us to reconsider what it means to heal, not just to fix the body but to transform the entire being, because true healing begins in the space between thought and breath, where awareness meets compassion, and in that space, anything becomes possible. What if the root of all illness isn't in the body at all? What if true healing begins not with pills or procedures, but with the mind itself? This question lies at the very heart of Buddhist wisdom, a tradition that has explored the mysteries of the mind and suffering for over 2,000 years. Buddhism teaches that the mind is the source of both suffering and liberation. The Buddha famously said, "All that we are is the result of what we have thought." Our thoughts, emotions, and mental habits shape not only our experience of life but also the very fabric of our health. Illness, from this perspective, arises when the mind is clouded by ignorance, attachment, and aversion, the three poisons that disturb inner peace. When the mind is trapped in cycles of craving and resistance, it creates tension and imbalance that ripple through the body. The Buddha compared this to a fire. If the fuel of anger, fear, or desire keeps feeding the flame, the fire will burn uncontrollably, consuming everything in its path. But when the mind learns to recognize these fires, to observe without judgment and let them pass, the heat cools, and the body begins to find rest. Central to this process is the practice of mindfulness, the art of paying attention with kindness and clarity to whatever arises in the present moment. Mindfulness allows us to see the subtle connections between our mental states and physical sensations. It reveals how stress tightens muscles, how fear accelerates the heartbeat, how sadness weighs down the breath. In Buddhism, healing the mind first means cultivating a gentle awareness that transforms our relationship with pain and illness. Instead of fighting or fearing discomfort, we learn to approach it with curiosity and compassion. This shift doesn't eliminate pain overnight, but it dissolves the secondary suffering, the mental anguish that often causes the greatest harm. Buddhist teachings offer practical tools for this transformation. The Four Noble Truths describe the nature of suffering, its origin, its cessation, and the path leading to freedom. By deeply understanding these truths, practitioners develop insight into the causes of their suffering and discover ways to heal at the source. One of the most profound practices is loving-kindness meditation, metta, an intentional cultivation of unconditional goodwill toward ourselves and others. This practice softens the heart's defenses, replacing hostility and fear with warmth and connection. When the mind opens to love, the body responds in kind. Scientific studies confirm that loving-kindness meditation reduces inflammation, lowers stress hormones, and improves cardiovascular health. Buddhism also teaches about equanimity, a balanced state of mind that remains steady amidst life's ups and downs. Equanimity allows us to face illness without despair and to embrace healing without grasping or aversion. It's a state where peace and resilience grow, even in the presence of physical pain. This holistic approach views healing as an inner journey, a gradual unfolding of wisdom, compassion, and freedom from mental bondage. It reminds us that the body and mind are inseparable, intertwined like two sides of the same coin. When the mind is healed, the body follows. Yet, Buddhism doesn't dismiss medical care or scientific advances. Instead, it encourages a harmonious integration of inner work and outer support. Meditation and mindfulness become powerful allies to modern medicine, amplifying its effects and nurturing lasting health. By healing the mind first, we open a door to a profound and sustainable form of wellness, one that transcends symptoms and reaches the very root of suffering. It's a path of awakening, where healing is not just recovery but transformation, and it invites each of us to become not passive patients but active participants in our own journey toward wholeness. This ancient perspective sheds light on why meditation can do more than reduce stress or ease pain. It helps us meet illness with courage, wisdom, and grace, and in doing so, it unlocks a healing power that lies dormant in every human heart. The true power of meditation often reveals itself not just in studies or theories but in the intimate stories of real people, stories that touch the heart and ignite hope. Imagine a woman diagnosed with a chronic autoimmune disease, told by doctors that her condition would likely worsen despite medication. She turned to meditation, initially skeptical but desperate for relief. Through daily mindfulness practice, she learned to calm the storm within, to observe her pain without fear, to breathe through moments of despair, and to cultivate compassion for herself. Months later, not only did her symptoms ease, but her doctors observed measurable improvements in her immune markers. Or consider a veteran haunted by the shadows of war, plagued by PTSD and unable to sleep for years. Traditional therapies offered limited relief, but with meditation, he found a sanctuary within his own mind. By gently facing traumatic memories without judgment, his anxiety lessened, nightmares faded, and peace began to bloom in the darkest corners of his heart. These stories are not isolated miracles. They echo across cultures and continents, from Buddhist monks in remote monasteries to busy professionals in bustling cities, from young adults grappling with depression to elders facing the challenges of aging. One remarkable case involves a man diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, who integrated meditation into his treatment plan. While medicine worked on his tumor, meditation nurtured his spirit, reduced his pain, and strengthened his resilience. His doctors noted improvements that defied expectations, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. Meditation doesn't claim to be a magic cure, but it offers something perhaps even more profound. A pathway to reclaim agency in the face of illness. It gives patients the tools to face uncertainty with courage, to reduce suffering by shifting their relationship to pain, and to awaken the body's natural healing potential. These healing stories also highlight the communal power of meditation. Support groups and meditation circles create spaces where people share their journeys, encouraging one another to persevere. The collective energy of mindfulness deepens individual transformation, reminding us that healing is never a solitary path. Science may explain how meditation changes the brain and body, philosophy illuminates the nature of suffering and the mind, but stories, these living testimonies, breathe life into theory. They reveal that healing through meditation is not a distant ideal but a vibrant reality available to all who dare to explore. They remind us that every breath taken with awareness carries the potential for transformation. Every moment spent in quiet presence plants a seed of hope and renewal. In these stories, the ancient promise resurfaces. The mind holds the key to healing the body. The journey is not easy. It requires patience, dedication, and courage, but the rewards, peace, resilience, and sometimes even remission, are profound. As we witness these real-life miracles, we glimpse the vast possibilities meditation unlocks, not just for the body, but for the soul. And with that hope, we step forward together, ready to embrace the final chapter. Healing is often seen as the end of pain, the disappearance of symptoms, the restoration of physical health. But what if healing is something far greater? What if the deepest medicine is not found in pills or procedures, but within the vast landscape of our own awareness? Meditation invites us to discover this profound truth. It teaches that beyond illness, beyond suffering, there is a space of peace that no disease can touch. A place where the mind is calm, the heart is open, and the body rests in harmony. This is the real medicine, the healing power of presence. By stepping out of the endless cycle of worry, fear, and resistance, we create room for genuine transformation. We begin to see illness not as an enemy, but as a teacher, a doorway to greater understanding and compassion. The journey of healing through meditation is not a straight path. It is filled with challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But with each breath, each moment of mindful awareness, we reclaim our power. We reconnect with the natural wisdom of the body and mind, the ancient and the modern meet here. Science confirming what the sages have long known: healing flows from the inside out. When the mind is at peace, the body follows. When the heart is open, true wellness blooms. And even if the body does not fully heal, meditation offers something equally precious: the ability to face life's uncertainties with grace, to find joy amid pain, strength amid vulnerability, and freedom amid limitation. This is the gift meditation gives to all who practice, a sanctuary of peace within, unshaken by the storms of illness or circumstance. So as you breathe, as you listen, know this: Healing is not just a destination, it is a continuous journey, a dance between body, mind, and spirit, and meditation is the path that guides us home. May you walk this path with courage and kindness, and may you find, in every moment, the real medicine, the healing power of your own awakened mind.